This is a fascinating question that a member of my Discord server and a viewer of my channel asked me, and I want to ask you guys. Answer this. Feel free to answer this in the comment section below. The Final Quarter, an Ohio State fan, asks, will the Ohio State defensive line or offensive line be better this year? If you want to ask me a question, whether it's a Buckeye-themed question or just a normal college football question, join my Discord server via the link in the description or pinned comment, and go to the hashtag YouTube Mailbox channel and ask me any question you have straight up, and I'll try my best to make a video on it. Since we're early enough in the preseason, I should be able to answer almost any question that's thrown my way, at least before the end of the year or before the end of the preseason if relevant. But anyway, the Buckeyes finished 14-2. Early in the year, the O-line looked top 10. D-line looked top 10. As the year progressed, the O-line kind of did like this, peaked, and then Simmons injury goes a little bit up during the Penn State game, collapses again with the McLaughlin injury. You could see against Indiana that they couldn't run block, and then against Michigan it was even worse. To be absolutely fair, though, those were some of the two best D-lines in America. Indiana, I think, had the best rushing defense last year. Michigan had the best overall defensive line. So it was pretty hard. But that also counterbalances with the fact that the O-line had a lot of help with skill position, quarterback. Anyway, it just went from being near elite to being, I would say, an average, above average unit. At times, in the postseason, it rose to the occasion. At times looked good. I wouldn't say it ever looked great, but that's just my opinion. Regardless, the lines of scrimmage for Ohio State, when you factored in the D-line, which went from being, I think, near elite to after that Oregon game where it took a dip, it went to being top 5, an elite D-line for sure. And the defensive supporting cast helped that. But objectively, looking at how Sawyer played at the end of the year, total non-negotiable. Tyleik Williams, non-negotiable. Tuimoloau, non-negotiable. Hamilton was having great moments and great play as well. They were a very physical team, not just on the lines of scrimmage, but just physical overall, elite at tackling, good in the fundamentals. They didn't beat themselves outside of those 2 losses they had, in particular against Michigan. The Oregon game, I think Oregon actually had more to do with that loss than Ohio State did. But regardless, they won the national title. They were one of the best teams in America last year. They'll be one of the best teams in America again this year. And correction, they were the best team in America last year. Just didn't want anyone to have to correct me on that. I like Ryan Day. I love the hire he made in Tyler Bowen. Larry Johnson is someone who recently has gotten a lot of criticism for his recruiting, and I actually empathize with Buckeye fans on that. It's frustrating. If you were Ohio State with the success you've had on the D-line traditionally, with who Larry Johnson used to be versus how he is now, and this is actually a topic of another question from an Ohio State fan that I'll probably answer in the next Withdrawal Wednesday. Yeah, it's frustrating, and it is unacceptable. And I think at some point, he will retire or he'll have to retire, if you catch the drift. But the question here from the Final Quarter, again, is will the Ohio State defensive line or offensive line be better this year? Just only looking at last year, the defensive line should be better. Looking at only returning production, the offensive line should be better. Looking at a variety of other things, you can really argue either way. And I thought I could, pull something out of my back pocket, but I couldn't, because there's just a variety of different combinations you could use to try and judge both units. The spring game would tell you that the O-line's going to be better. What all the insiders are saying tells you the O-line would be better. The team is telling you that the O-line will be better. And I think to a certain degree, I absolutely understand that. But what I will also say is that when you look at how both units played last year and even how the backups did it in rotation, D-line looked pretty good, even some of the backup defensive linemen. It's really tough to judge. It is really tough to judge. And what makes it tougher when you're Ohio State in comparison to almost any other team is your skill position and backfield talent is so good that at some times they absolutely compensate for the defensive or offensive front. Think of the O-line last year. I watched that Northwestern game. This was still when McLaughlin was center. Ohio State could not run block to save their life. But it didn't matter. You know why it didn't matter? Because the wide receivers were good. Because Howard was playing a good game. And because when Northwestern got penetration and got into the backfield, Judkins and Henderson just put out their arm or lowered their shoulder and turned what should have been a -2 or -3 yard gain into a 2 or 3 yard gain. Ohio State last year may have had 2 Kenneth Walkers in the backfield. They had a quarterback who, despite Ohio State's O-line giving up more pressures per sack than Nebraska's O-line did, had almost a third of the sacks Raiola incurred because Howard had pocket mobility. He had eyes in the back of his head. It was very obvious that he was an aware, intelligent quarterback who also had skill and moxie. Raiola hadn't developed a lot of those skills at Nebraska, so despite the fact that on a pressures allowed per snap basis, that his pass blocking was a little bit better, Howard was just that much more experienced and had so much better weapons to where that overruled maybe Nebraska's entire offensive line unit being a little bit better in pass blocking. That's a stat, actually. Nebraska's offensive line and Iowa's for sure, Oregon's, and I think 2 other teams. Oh, Rutgers, I know, was one. I forget who the 5th was, and maybe there was a 6th. They had less pressures allowed per snap than Ohio State's offensive line did, which shouldn't be all that surprising. To some people, I think it would be surprising. And then you look at the defensive line for the Buckeyes, and the defensive line last year was mean. It was nasty. It was one of the better position groups in all of college football, one of the best in their own camp, and that was with a strong D-line class last year. Penn State, Michigan, Indiana, Notre Dame's when healthy. I mean, Texas with all their depth, and Oregon's even, who had a first-round D-tackle picked in Derek Harmon. We could go on and on and on. And the defensive line last year, their issue is they don't return any of their starters from 24 to 25. The O-line brings back Hinsman, who I'd classify as a full starter for the year, started more than half the games. They return Tegra Shabola, starter for the entire year. Luke Montgomery, who started in the playoffs, I wouldn't classify him as a full-on starter, though, just because he only started in the playoffs. They bring in Ethan Anainwa, who was a starter. They also bring in Phillip Daniels, who, much like Montgomery, started at the end of the year for Minnesota, but wasn't a full-time starter. The D-line only brings in Bo Atkinson and Logan George. Those are DNs. They didn't bring in anyone at D-tackle, and I would say out of all the incoming transfers and all the groups, Anainwa is, I would say Anainwa is probably the best. Maybe Atkinson, but regardless of that, I think the O-line did a better job getting necessary pieces in the portal and making sure they returned production compared to the D-line. Now, the D-line couldn't bring any of their starters back. All of them were seniors. But the fact that the D-line's been in the position it has in the spring, where they were desperate to get D-tackle depth, the Buckeyes were, and they couldn't for whatever reason. They couldn't do it. I think Texas had something to do with that, and the fact that Ryan Day is not a fan of overpaying players. And you know what? I respect that, actually. That's how it should be. You shouldn't have to, hash out millions of dollars for a rotational D-tackle. Or if you do, it should be in a world where, maybe teams have a more level playing field. Not saying Ohio State's NIL is more average than great. It has one of the best NIL collectives in the country, just not quite Texas or Oregon level. All that being said, the O-line did a better job, I think, of addressing its weaknesses than the D-line did. When you look at blue chip talent and when you look at how these units, in terms of the current starters, performed in their games or roles, the D-line overall was better. I think Caden McDonald, Edric Houston, Kenyatta Jackson Jr., and to a certain degree Caden Curry performed better in their roles last year than the average of Carson Hinsman, Tegra Shabola, Luke Montgomery, Phillip Daniels, Ethan Anainwa, or Saraveld. Not much of a big difference, and it's hard to factor in the transfers with that. But then again, if I factor in Bo Atkinson with the D-line, and Atkinson was a good D-end last year, the argument for the D-line goes up. I will say when looking at the spring game and when watching it, Ohio State's O-line was able to get some push. They were. I don't know if that was a fluke. I don't know if maybe the fact that Ohio State, at least in some of their spring game, wasn't, playing tackle ball, so there is contact, but there isn't going to be the same, it's a practice, and you don't want to get your starters hurt, so there isn't going to be the same, rough and tough, and they're rotating guys, so Ohio State, they're mixing in guys constantly. So I don't think there's a clear answer here. I think the O-line or D-line could be better than the other. And maybe I'm being incorrect here. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, but almost intuitively, I want to go with the D-line being a little bit better. Because despite what we saw in spring, there's a chance that that's just a spring practice. You can't take too much away from the spring games. I really like what Caden McDonald and Edric Houston have to offer in terms of talent. Same with Jackson Jr. and same with Bo Atkinson. I think the D-line is a higher ceiling than the offensive line does. They're more straight up, they're more talented and the room's been better recruited. Now, has it been better developed? We'll have to see. And I think that Bowen, on top of being an elite recruiter, is going to have good developmental traits. I do. Otherwise, why wouldn't have Day hired him? Day's hires recently, and his hires in his whole history, especially on the offensive line, have, I think, panned out rather well, outside of Justin Fry. Lachlan, upgrade over Alford. Keenan Bailey, I think great hire. Retaining Hartline, promoting him to be the wide receivers coach. Best move he could have ever made. And then hiring Bowen, I think, was awesome. It was exactly what Ohio State needed. So when I look at the Buckeyes and their trench play, I think that with all they lose all their first-round talent, all of the possible NFL talent they could have lost from those rooms, they did. So I think the trenches overall will take a step back from last year on an average basis, especially on the D-line where they lose 4 guys. The O-line actually, I think, has a chance of improving, and a solid one at that. The D-line does not. They will definitely be taking a step back. It's like Michigan's D-line. Michigan's D-line will definitely be taking a step back, and Michigan only loses 3 guys and actually brought in transfers in the winter window. Ohio State loses even more than Michigan does. They didn't rotate as much as Michigan does. They haven't developed as well in the D-line, and college performance and NFL draft selection and even NFL performance over the past 4 years will tell you that. And just case in point, if Michigan's D-line is definitely going to regress, and it will, then Ohio State certainly is, based on the losses and different things. So right now I'm going to go with the D-line, but I wouldn't be shocked at all here if I were wrong. I'm not confident in saying that whatsoever. I'm just kind of going off what was the case last year, a little bit of blue chip ratio, a little bit of what I saw from the current projected starters in their 2024 play, a little bit of PFF grades, a little bit of the fact that Bowen is going to be in his first year, and the offense will look at least a little different from where it was last year with Day handing the play calls to Chip Kelly in comparison to Brian Hartline.